Education is preparation for reparations.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening to sow the seeds of planet repairs. That's what the day's about. We've been working all day actually with our guests that have come a long way from different parts of the world to connect with our local community here. But this evening on this panel, we're going to be discussing, well, the topic is planet repairs. But first I'm just going to introduce myself actually. My name's Connor. I'm part of the local community here. Amongst everyone here, a lot of people here that's part of the local community, but I'm also a part of a local group called Community Action for Land Liberation, which is a part of the PRELA process, PRELA being the Planet Repairs Action Learning Education Revolution. And I've been invited and mandated to chair this panel this evening. Like I said, it's on planet repairs. But I'm going to open just quickly introducing what the Decolonial Open Communiversity is. So, for short, DOC, the Decolonial Open Communiversity, is a space for all peoples from across the world to share their diverse cultures, wisdoms, knowledges, skills, and understandings and contexts in order to effectively unify our paths to repair humanity and Mother Earth. It's about learning collectively through transforming the world. So the DOC has brought together peoples from Peru, Ghana, South Africa, and Mexico to the UK to tour key spaces and sites here to document learnings together with our movements. It aims to give UK-based organisers a place to come together and reflect on our movements and build strategy to integrate our learnings from the delegations to strengthen our fight for justice. So this space is a space for education, but it's a lot more than that. It's a space to start to counter or continue to counter the criminal miseducation that's going on in our institutional education systems, in our schools, in our universities, through the media, and through every place that empire decides to show its ugly head. So the goal of education should be to develop knowledge, skills, and attitudes to serve the needs and the requirements of our peoples through action learning, in order to ensure society's integral social and cultural development with respect for peoples and Mother Earth rights. And that's what we've been doing today, before this panel. So the aim of this panel on planet repairs is to bring about our collective perspectives on the process of decolonisation and how our communities organise themselves towards this process, sharing lived experiences on the potential that internationalist solidarity can offer our communities, and at the same time opening an honest space for the difficult aspects of this action learning process. And just to contextualise, planet repairs is a very specific concept that has come out of the international social movement for African reparations. There's a little board over here, if you can see it. It consists of three core tenets: cognitive justice, preparatory justice, and environmental justice. One is not possible without the others. And with that, I'm going to just introduce, I'm going to allow our panelists here to introduce themselves.
Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Omar Farouk. I come from Mexico City. My organization, grassroots media collective organization, is called Radio Zapote. We are a collective occupation in the National School of Anthropology and History in the south of Mexico City, just next to the pyramid of Cuicuilco. And I want to thank you for being here and to come and listen to us.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Piwaba Matwokwe. I am from a country in Africa which does not have a name, but it's just a geographical location called South Africa. I think as we discuss, we'll get into that. I'm an activist representing different spaces of activism, one of which is Paris, and another, and various other ones as well. I do not want to be boxed into the organizations that I represent, because I feel that whenever I'm in these spaces, I'm representing all voices of South Africans, all voices of Pan-Africanists, and also all voices of all oppressed across the world. Thank you.
My name is Kobina Amakwando. I am based here and part of various networks and campaigning in and around Pan-African reparations, and part of the Pan-African Reparations International Standing Conference, or Paris for short. Glad to be here and keen for us to start the conversation with the Decolonial Open Communiversity.
Turikuna yeyekuna sumatuta hamkunapa, sutime Julia Rosita, yujaja jamuni proyectamanta canife mucarina. Muy buenas noches con todas y todos. Soy de Perú, del departamento de Purímac, de la provincia de Andahuaylas, de la comunidad Quichua. Soy de la Federación Nacional de Mujeres Campesinas Artesanas Indígenas Nativas Salares del Perú. Soy quechua, soy chanca. Muchas gracias.
Good evening to all of you. My name is Rosita. I'm from the region of Apulimac in Andahuaylas. I form a part of the FENMUGANINAP, the National Federation of Peasant, Artisan, Indigenous, Native Worker Women from Peru. And I'm also Quechua and Chinca.
This is the first open event, really, of the Decolonial Open Communiversity, so we welcome you all here, first and foremost. We think it's very important because it's very important that particularly colonised communities of resistance have their say on the question of decoloniality, which has become a discourse in lots of different spaces, far removed from the real resistance and realities that are happening on the ground. And the very important point is that not only the knowledge produced from those processes deserves to be heard and it deserves to be known, it's also these are the solutions, the reparatory justice solutions to a lot of the crimes that we're seeing now, taking place across society but around the world. It's also important that this is happening inside the United Kingdom, because we know that the United Kingdom has parented a lot of the violence and criminality that has spawned and spread across the world. And so there's actually a specific demand coming increasingly from colonised communities of resistance about what people here should be doing as far as an equitable, fair and reparatory response to the crisis of imperialism. We've already had some internal discussions and various types of conversations, and it's already come out the very clear need to make sure that decolonisation isn't left in the air, that it's about visibility, that security is very important, that increasingly we're seeing the overwhelming violence of fascism spread across the world and militarisation. These are the real realities that are being faced by communities in national liberation struggles. And the aspects of communications and visibility is very important to how we counter this. It's also important that we discussed briefly this idea about international solidarity and how we decolonize it. Because international solidarity has become, again, a bit of a broad topic. Everything is about solidarity. But what does that really mean? What does that meaningfully look like? What is it and what isn't? And it's not that there aren't already answers to this. There are very clear instructions coming from colonised communities about what is to be done, what movements need to be built, and how we build them. There's also a rich ancestral legacy of when our colonised communities have come together and actually organised and are winning back power, taking back their lands, and beating back imperialism. And these are part of the very violent miseducations that we don't know this story, we don't know these struggles, and this is what's keeping us actually in the situation we are, where we are a particular colonised part of the world that has very little organised resistance, capable of being active support to the escalating violence happening around the world. I'll keep it brief because there's much to be said from the Preparatory Commission, who are working not just for the events that we see that are happening across the United Kingdom, but have the Commission and the mandate to build a decolonial open community with those people of interest who want to have truthful, honest dialogue about the real realities that are happening in the world, and to not shy away from the actual experiences of real people, as well as those of us, of course, here, who have much to share, who also know exactly what a colonised experience is. And this is important because we're yet to create and establish the type of institutions that mean that our education is completely liberated from the lies of white supremacy, from the lies of criminal violence, and from also making us complicit in the crimes that are happening around the world, because that is the main fact that we have to start with. And because it is that we do not want to be complicit, we have chosen to work alongside colonised communities of resistance, to convene ongoing spaces in collaboration where we plan to organise ourselves outside of criminality and also actively in support of stopping the harm. And this is particularly important because one aspect that gets lost and it was being lost, particularly was targeted right now, is the question of reparatory justice. Where there's a deliberate attempt to make reparations and reparatory justice about some number that's been plucked from someone's head and put in the sky as something that we're going to be targeting so that we can start to plan how we can get some crumbs for ourselves to live off. When in fact, the overwhelming message from the global majority of colonised communities is that we want our land back, we are taking our land back, we need our right to our own education, and we need to also undo the harm of centuries of miseducation. That means that we've lost who we are. It's also, I think, particularly important that we talk about truthful and honest dialogue because that violence is escalating, and within our own context, those of us who are repatriating or organising as part of various communities of resistance, there are live struggles that we see around us that need to be heard and known. In the context of West Africa, from which I hail, from an indigenous Akan nation that spans the borders of Ghana and Ivory Coast and many more. I was born in this country to Ghanaian parents who migrated here because of the particular crimes of British corporations like Anglo Gold, who went into Ghana and expelled and dispersed millions of indigenous people for the extraction of gold. Now we also know that in times of war, like we're in now with World War III, the price of gold goes up because everyone panics and looks for something that feels secure. That gold comes from somewhere, and just like in the 50s and 60s, when the end of the last so-called World War happened, there was another scramble for Africa and its resources. It was these companies that created the political economic crises that created many of the diaspora today. And it's out of that heritage that this conversation has to continue about how our indigenous communities can be heard, about taking back their lands and be supported and respected from the knowledges that have come from their own communities' experiences. And I mention that because particularly one of the programs that is very live right now, that some of us are involved in, is the upcoming Ghana elections. And this has been a very dynamic year with elections all around the world. And there are elections on December the 7th in Ghana, and various communities of resistance, many indigenous communities of resistance, leading activists like people that have been collaborated with, like the Ghana and Planet Repairs Action Dialogue and the Pro and Criminal Unity Movement, have been trying to chart a path outside of the colonial development of the two main political parties. But this is a country that, because of the reality of colonialism, is facing multiple crises about its economy. This is a country where by 2030 it's expected that we will be importing water to drink. Now these are the real realities because of the colonial crimes. And the cries are being there, and young people have been really mobilising to the point of expropriating and trying to shut down these criminal crime scenes on our lands. None of this visibility is shown, we're told, on the BBC. None of this is shared in the global north, but it's actively the collaboration of NATO and UK government and others who are actively taking your taxpayer money and militarising countries like Ghana so that they can seize the West Coast and make sure that they have ownership over our lands and resources. This is what's also happening in the name of a so-called just transition, so that this country can maintain an image of security while it continues to plunder from the rest of the world. And this is the basis of how we also decolonize international solidarity, because these truths need to be understood, we have to study, and we have to organize against these very practical things in live time. Relevant to that, there will be a monitoring process that's happening, particularly around the elections, so that people can also follow that process and understand some of these crimes, and also be active and participating on the very real possibilities of escalating violence, which we're seeing. And that's just a brief introduction to what we mean by decolonization and the actual reality of escalating imperialism and global violence. It wasn't a long enough time to really give real room to it, but the rest of our colleagues can say a lot more about their experiences.
Thank you. I think it's important as well to just, in our definition of decoloniality, to actually stress more than anything else that decoloniality is not just about educating and education primarily, but it is about reversing and uprooting all forms of coloniality and all its manifestations, behind the backdrop that coloniality never ended, especially for the African continent, which is something that the world thinks has happened because we've been told that this African country is celebrating X amount of years of independence. This African country is celebrating X amount of years. Like he's speaking about Ghana right now, we are told that Ghana was celebrating 67 years of independence. But today we're also told that the same Ghana is experiencing the worst forms of violent human rights abuses. And that is primarily because the indigenous and the people of Ghana have had enough. And that is happening across all African countries. There's very few that have actually been able to uprise and rise up and be able to confront the system. Now, when you speak about coloniality, we know very well that it has never been a very buddy, hey, can I come chill at your place for a couple of days type of situation. It's always been a very violent dispossession of people's land, of people's minerals, of people's very lives, and even animals, for instance. And that is happening right now. So when we say that coloniality has not ended, it means that the dispossession of Africans, of people from Asia, of people from Abiyala, of their land, of their indigenous land, is still ongoing, and it is still very violent. And that is why when we speak about decoloniality, we cannot speak about it and not speak about the security question. Because when you dispossess people of their land and you refuse to give it back to them, decades later, hundreds of years later, you have actually created a situation where they are not secure, they have nowhere to stay, they have nowhere to live. That is the first thing. Secondly, when these communities come and they respond and they say they want their land back, for instance, just to also give some perspective, because most of you were not in the earlier sessions. I come from South Africa. Almost 80% of the population there is peoples are racialized as Africans or black, but we own only about 4% of the land. South Africans who are racialized as white, who are about 7% of the population, they own 72% of the land. So that is the disparity that is happening in that country, such that even if you were to go on Google, you would find out that you will be told that it's one of the most unequal societies. And that inequality actually stems from the fact that our people to this day are still landless, they are still dispossessed, and over and above that, they are actually still being killed, they're still being arrested, they're still being tortured for actually speaking the truth and saying that there is no freedom that we got. We are also handed a hero in the name of Nelson Mandela. If we ever had that, who is actually seen and celebrated everywhere in the world. And if it was true that he actually did any work, I would not have been sitting here today. I would have actually been doing what other young people are doing with their lives, especially those who have everything that their ancestors owned, everything that they were supposed to have on them. You have communities not only being dispossessed, but whenever they try to organize and respond to all the forms of coloniality, they are killed. All sorts of security measures around them are just bad. You have activists same thing, they are killed, they are arrested, and all sorts of things. You go to parliament, for instance. I was a member of parliament in South Africa, by the way. And even in those processes, while you are sitting in the parliamentary chambers, there is private security that is in the chambers with you. People were not elected to be part of those processes. And if you say something that the ruling party has a problem with, they would actually snatch us out. I think the Economic Freedom Fighters is actually known as a political party where people they are known as rowdy and violent and all these things, but in actual fact, it is them that have been at the receiving end of the violence, because whenever they spoke on behalf of our people, they would not only just be violently ejected from the parliamentary chambers, but would be beaten up more outside. The other question, the issue of when you look at security as well, you look at that how the African continent has so many foreign military bases. You can actually go on your phone and actually just Google their geographic spread as well. And you must look at those, look at the wars that are happening in the continent, and also look at the minerals that are around there. And again, it goes back to the question of just transition. That when you say that we are moving for just transition, which is actually a genuine cause, where are those minerals coming from and how are they being extracted, and who is at the receiving end of the just transition conversation? Communities are being killed, wars are being waged, and everything that is happening, and those that are actually benefiting, including those that are supposed to be benefiting from the West, are actually being used to actually create chaos in our spaces. And therefore the question of security becomes a very big one. You look at, for instance, your DRC, you look at your Sudan, where in a space of 1 year, over 16 million people have been displaced. And people are not even bothered about those things. People are probably not even aware of those things. We're looking at, for instance, that just this week, a number of activists, hundreds of them, community members, not just activists, were facing a death penalty in Nigeria, and they were in courts, and about 29 children are actually part of those people that are facing a death penalty, such that the kids started collapsing in the courts. That is how bad things are, and what is our responsibility as the world to have that conversation. And then just in closing, I think the community, especially of UK, I think Brother Kwamina did actually explain what has been the role of UK, particularly in coloniality. But I was actually quite, I wouldn't say traumatized, but somewhere near that, to actually find out that there's a supposed memorial wall that was built in 2002 on this very land, celebrating what would have been the plunder and the killing of our people, where all our countries, where all our continents are actually put there and paraded as the pride of the UK in terms of what they've done to our people. And somewhere, somehow, there's no one from the UK who's actually asking, how are you still putting up such monuments in our name? Why are you still celebrating murderers? Why are you still celebrating people who have actually created chaos and actually putting it as if you've actually done and assisted people?
Thank you, sister. So I was trying to emphasize the origin of our organization in 2001 in the National School of Anthropology because of a story that I'm going to tell you now. We also, as a news media grassroots collective called Radio Zapote, we are not a single organization. We are a network of organizations within our group and surrounding us, of an umbrella of organizations, of media collectives in many countries, and also political organizations. So I'm also part of the Planet Prepares International Observatory. So I was talking about the school, the National School of Anthropology, in which we have the occupation. Right now we have the radio station there. When I went as a student in 2004 into that university, from my generation, one of our colleagues, students, was disappeared. in April 19, 2004. So his name was Pavel González Garcia. He appeared some days later. He was assassinated, he was tortured, he was sexually tortured, and his body appeared hanging on a tree in the woods near to the city. So when this happened, I remember that I was going through the aisles of the school with my friend. We were studying anthropology, linguistics, and I say that as a joke to him because we knew that in the 70s, in the Guerra Sucia, in the dirty war of the Cold War, where the guerrillas were happening in Mexico, many people got disappeared and tortured and assassinated. And I said as a joke to my friend, hey, it's happening again, people are getting disappeared again. But at that time, we would never have imagined that this was going to happen in a massive way in Mexico, and in Central America in general. So this is what we call the form of the serpent that you can see through the membrane, in the egg, in that metaphorical sense that many of you know. Because what we were seeing was the first symptoms of the fascism, of the state-sponsored terror that was going to descend upon our country, or a collective of nations. So this happened in 2004. Pavel González, he was a student of anthropology, and he was a student of the Faculty of Philosophy in the UNAM, in the National University of Mexico. But he was involved in the struggle because he sold coffee from the Zapatista organizations. He was supporting the communities in that way. So, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the Army of Liberation, of National Liberation, Zapatista Army, they had an uprising in 1994. And this uprising, the fundamental issue of this struggle is recovering the land. And recovering the land means that you need to have autonomy in your region by your own traditions, to plant the land and to harvest the land and to develop as you want to. So since then there has been a long story of paramilitary violence against them. And we can say that since 1996 up to today, 128 members of the National Indigenous Congress, which is the national organic indigenous organization of the Zapatista Liberation Army that works with them, with the communities from the Zapatistas in Chiapas, they have been assassinated. 128 land defenders from indigenous communities. So since this time up until today, we can say that there was a humanitarian crisis in Mexico. Since 2006, it's gotten worse, which is what I was talking about, of the serpent and fascism descending upon our nation. And we could talk about estimated numbers, and I could tell you a lot of numbers, and I did that last time, But I wanted to go back a little, and since I'm really impressed by the community work that you have here, and the glass houses, and all of the crops, that you have developed from all over the world. I haven't seen something like that in my whole life, not even in the glass houses of the National University of Mexico, which are really in a bad shape. I wanted to talk about these crops, colonialism, this like potato, because going back to the National School of Anthropology, where they killed students, you could find the historiographers, that talk about how this crop, the potato crop, when it was taken to Europe, it became. I'm really blind. When it was taken to Europe between the 16th and 17th century, it promoted that the population of Europe, it went up by 60%. So that's an important fact. There's another historian who's called Tabara, who has the unfortunate name of his book that is called The Shadow of Islam in the Conquest of the Americas. So he explains that the minerals that were taken from the Abya Yala, they supported the European nations in their fight against the Ottoman Empire. So then they needed these metals for the ships and for the weapons for the war. So in the reality of things, going back and going up until now, we see that the colonialism came to our nations. Then they took the crops that came from science, from really, really complex science. We don't know how they knew how to make these crops by adapting the seeds, because they burned all the books, almost all of the books. But they left us with the plantations, no? And they left us with the ideology that genocide was civilization, and that enslavement of our people was civilization. No? But the product of these civilizations, it was immensely beneficial to these nations. So I'm just trying to hurry now, because I only just stopped my 2 minutes. But I wanted to finish with a practical sense of this. When I say that we are a network of organizations inside a collective and outside a collective in a very informal way, in an occupation in the university, which is attacked now by state terrorism, this has to be because there's a silencing of the struggle, there's a silencing of this knowledge. Even within the university, this type of knowledge, the colonial knowledge, is not in front. Teachers don't talk about it, no? When the student goes into the school, he makes an exam full of colonial propaganda, even within this university. No? So what our organization tried to do since the beginning, and I'm not talking about myself, no? I'm talking about all the people that have been there, and I went in some time. I went like 10 years ago, but there were other people, no? The founders. The responsibility, somehow people knew what they had to do, and they had to develop these kind of organizations with the responsibility to always keep a foot in the front lines of the process of resistance. So in the literal sense, not the physical sense, a foot in the process of resistance. So this responsibility has been maintained by our network of organizations since these 20 years, no? And each year is getting worse. So only yesterday, I think the UNESCO presented a report about journalists being assassinated. And the report mentions Mexico in 2022, 2023, it mentions 26 journalists being assassinated that they have been registered. And this is almost the same number that they give for Palestine in those years. And now we know the situation of genocide against the Palestinian people is extreme, and the journalists have been at the front lines. So I just want us to go from the decolonial knowledge that can be brought upon to break this propaganda, but also to propose that I cannot say what anyone should do to support in an internationalist sense the struggle in the world, but I can only mention the things that we have been doing, no? And we have been doing this because when I say a foot in the front lines, it's because I mean that was the only way that we could feel that we are not complicit, that we are not responsible, and that we are doing something, no? And this something that we do is putting a physical foot or an abstract, no? You may understand it how you may, but you have to put a foot in the front lines, and that is the only way that we can save our soul from being complicit with this genocide. Thank you.
Bueno, nosotros como Abya Yala, desde nuestra mirada de cómo miramos el decolonialismo, nosotros impulsamos nuestras propias reglas, lo que llamamos el buen vivir. Es nuestro término más adecuado en los pueblos indígenas. Impulsamos nuestras propias estructuras, impulsamos a través de la propia educación que no se pierdan nuestras lenguas, como el aymara, el quechua, el ayaninca, el shipibu, el aguajú, el guampís, que son lenguas ancestrales, lenguas que aún conservamos en nuestros pueblos indígenas, También la otra forma es la salud. Hay un ejemplo muy breve. En pandemia, los pueblos indígenas tuvieron menos muertos que, digamos, el centro de la capital. Fuimos los pueblos que resistimos más a través de nuestra medicina ancestral, que hasta el día de hoy lo practicamos.
Well, we, as peoples, as indigenous peoples from Abya from our vision, the way we see decolonialism is that we impose it from our own rules, what we call the when we read. This is the best way in which we push our own structures through our own education, our own indigenous languages like Aymara, Quechua, Awajún, One Piece, and the many other indigenous languages that are ancestral languages that we still maintain in our indigenous territories. We also protect our indigenous health systems and ensure that, and one key example of this was that during the COVID pandemic, actually in our indigenous communities there were less deaths than in the cities because we were able to actually carry out our ancestral medicine techniques.
Bien, también otra manera es de cómo conservamos nuestra cultura a lo que nosotros, nuestra cultura es la manera en cómo vestimos, cómo trabajamos, cómo labramos la tierra. No llamamos cultura a lo que últimamente hacen nuestros gobiernos, ¿no? A los pueblos indígenas nos utilizan como folclore, utilizan nuestros cantos, nuestros bailes, como para hacer publicaciones o publicidades a través de ello, como vendiendo algo que no es real. La cultura nuestra se respeta. Y entonces nosotros trabajamos en eso, en cómo conservar nuestra propia cultura sin que se vea algo mercantil. De otra manera también es cómo nosotros conservamos nuestra soberanía alimentaria. Nosotros y nosotras como pueblos conservamos mucho la semilla autóctona, no la semilla que mantenemos, que nosotros llamamos los bancos de semillas. Hasta el momento hemos recuperado las 7 variedades de quinoa. Antes había 12 variedades de quinoa que ya se perdieron, pero estamos recuperándola de la misma manera la papa, al igual que la oca, la masua, el oyuco, que son variedades ancestrales. El otro punto es también
another way in which another thing that we have to conserve is that we have to conserve our culture. This is really important because, you know, this is not just our dress, it's not just our dances, it's not just our traditions and customs. And culture is not just this sort of folklore that these governments try to portray, but it's something, you know, that it's not just our dances, it's not just, you know, what is shown, but it is our struggle. And también we also conserve our sovereignty, especially our food sovereignty, and the sovereignty of our lands. At the moment, for example, we've been struggling to recover also our seeds. So we've been struggling to recover, for example, the 7 different variations of quinoa, also the variations of potato and other seeds.
Bien. A través de eso también es que impulsamos mucho la economía propia, lo que llamamos el trueque, el AINI, hasta el día de hoy, en donde no permitimos que el Estado imponga a través de los pueblos nuestra propia autonomía, nuestra propia determinación de cómo podemos manejar nuestros productos, nuestros trueques. Y bueno, desde nuestra mirada, desde la solidaridad internacional, nosotros como pueblos creemos que uno es que no nos deben imponer el colonialismo, que creemos que se debe construir una solidaridad internacional impulsando desde la mano nuestra propia estructura como pueblos, ¿no? Un ejemplo grande es cuando Perú estuvo atravesando en el 2023, que se inició el 7 de diciembre, donde se realizó los asesinatos en los departamentos de nuestro país. Empezamos por Apurímac, que fueron 6 muertos en un solo día, luego fue en Ayacucho 8 muertos, de ahí en Puno se dio la matanza más grande de 18 muertos. En la actualidad tenemos 84 asesinados. los que fallecieron son hijos del pueblo, son hermanos, son padres, son ancestros, a quien el gobierno actual pues los ha arrebatado la vida solo por alzar la voz, solo por reclamar nuestros derechos, por pedir que sean escuchadas, por pedir que no nos sigan arrebatando, despojando de nuestras tierras, quitándonos incluso la propia educación intercultural.
So we've also been strengthening our own economies, like for example the Treke and the Aini, and we do this so that the state doesn't impose on us their own forms of systems. This is why we have to push our own autonomy from our vision and from our own solidarity. We believe that, and in terms of solidarity, we believe that you shouldn't impose colonialism on us, which rather is held in the hands of our own indigenous structures as structures as peoples. In 2023, on the 7th of December, when there was a coup in our country, there were various different assassinations. For example, in Apurimac, 7 people were killed just in one day. In Ayacucho, 9 people were assassinated. In Puno, 18 people were assassinated. And in total, more than 50 people were assassinated. These are parents, their elders that have been killed just for standing up for the right of taking back their lands, talking about their rights, also for preserving their intercultural institutions and educational institutions.
Bueno, entonces yo quería mostrar una imagen que vimos por allá. Esto es una imagen de Puno de una de nuestras compañeras a quienes le quitaron la vida a uno de sus hijos.
I just wanted to show an image of one of the women. This is an image from Peru of one of the mothers that they assassinated her child.
Y así muchas de nuestras hermanas y compañeras pues perdieron a un hijo, perdieron a un esposo, y otros a los que no se cuentan, a los que lamentablemente también fueron reprimidos y llegaron a los centros médicos y fallecieron después de eso, y otros que no podían ser atendidos porque cuando tú ibas a un centro médico, basta que tú decías que estabas en una protesta y en una marcha, inmediatamente te metían a un proceso judicial. Entonces muchos por ese temor no iban a ser atendidos. Respecto a todo ese caso, se llevó a que nuestros líderes y dirigentes nacionales tenían que escapar por una represión política. Dentro de ello tenemos a nuestra presidenta Lourdes Huanca, que ya tuvo que estar un año fuera de nuestro país, porque ella tuvo que demandar lo que estaba sucediendo en nuestro país. Tenía que ser visible lo que estaba sucediendo en nuestro país. Ella se sintió obligada a estar fuera de nuestro país, porque si ella regresaba, pues obviamente las represalias iban a ser inmediatas y hasta incluso quitarle la vida, que es lo que se podría decir el pan de cada día de nuestros dirigentes, estar expuestos a este tipo de cosas, ¿no? Y bueno.
So many people, they lost their children in these marches. Many of us lost our friends, our families, children's, etc. And there were also many that were actually died as a result of their injuries. Many people weren't able to attend even the medical institutions because when they were being repressed for standing up, if they went to the medical institutions, they knew that if they found out that they'd been participating in these protests, then they would immediately be suffering criminalization. For that reason, many of our leaders had to actually leave the country, including Lourdes. She had to, Lourdes Huanca, who is the president of our organization, she had to be outside of our country for a year, and she actually took that time to denounce what was happening in our lands, because we knew that if she came back, the repression would be really heavy and they would even come and assassinate her. This is the daily life of our defenders and our indigenous leaders.
Entonces mi país estuvo casi como 6 o 8 meses viviendo una dictadura cívico-militar. Nos han cohibido de las protestas, nos han arrebatado, como decir, nuestros derechos. Estábamos cohibidos a protesta porque si no éramos directamente criminalizados o nos decían la palabra de terroristas, en el hecho de levantar nuestras voces. Y creemos que la solidaridad internacional tiene un gran objetivo de cómo articular y trabajar con estos pueblos del Abya Yala, no solo en Latinoamérica y el Caribe, sino en el mundo. Como decía, no importa el color, la raza, las lenguas, o lo que podamos portar que nos haga diferenciar. Todos somos un puño, como decimos, la unidad hace la fuerza. Y la solidaridad internacional tiene que empujar eso, el articular con los pueblos, el que respeten nuestro propio proyecto, nuestra propia manera de cómo trabajamos, de que no nos vean como si fuéramos unos niños pobrecitos o que necesitamos, de que nos tienen que ayudar, o el hecho que nos puedan brindar un solvente económico no quiere decir que nos tienen que imponer o tienen que tomar decisiones por nosotras o nosotros como pueblos. Es todo lo contrario, tienen que respetar y como decir, adaptarse a cómo nosotros como pueblos resistimos hasta el día de hoy, seguimos trabajando en que se haga visible lo que estamos pasando, no solo en mi país, en diferentes países de Latinoamérica que estamos enfrentando hoy en día a diferentes gobiernos. Entonces, creemos desde nuestra mirada de la Abya Yala que la solidaridad internacional tiene que ser eso, trabajar de mano a mano, de codo a codo, articulizando, tejiendo hilos en una sola trenza, siendo la quinoa de 1000 colores, siendo todas las sangres. Y quiero culminar con esto, que somos como la paja del páramo, que nos pueden cortar pero volvemos a crecer. Muchas gracias.
And so for many months my country was living a civic military dictatorship, where they denied us the right to protest, and every time we went out in the streets they would call us terrorists for raising our voices. And so that is for the reason why when we articulate our solidarity and our international solidarity, it has to articulate not just in Abya Yala but across the world, because it extends beyond the color of our skin, our race or the language that we use. We have to be one hand, or rather one fist, and the solidarity is what will have to push us forward. For us, we have to begin to first, between us as peoples, respect our own processes. And you should stop seeing us like, well, you hand out stuff too, you know? Like charity, you know, like poor people, you know, stop looking at us like poor people. You cannot impose conditions on us with your money. You need to first of all, foremost, respect us, how we as indigenous communities organize to this day, and part of the solidarity is also visibilizing what is happening in Abya Yala and across the world. The solidarity, it has to be working hand by hand and arm by arm. We're all unified threads. We're the quinoa of many different colors. We're one unified blood. We're like the like the weeds in the ground. Thank you.
Antes de culminar, voy a hacer una pequeña...
Just to culminate, I'm going to do a little...
Voy a hacer una pequeña dinámica, recordando la memoria de una de nuestras queridas compañeras sabias que hace poco partió, que es María Sangama. Nos vamos a poner todos de pie.
Okay, basically just to remember one of our sisters that actually very recently she parted from this world. We're going to do a little dynamic, so I want to ask you all to stand on your feet.
Ha sido muy bonito que ella esté.
It would have been really beautiful for her to be here present.
Pero sé que está al lado de nuestros grandes sabios y sé que desde ahí está también iluminando mi camino y guiándome, porque fue una de mis mentoras también.
I know that she's here, she's guiding me because she was also one of my mentors, so I wish she was here with us, but I know that she's guiding us and giving us strength.
Yo voy a hacer una pequeña canción, yo lo voy a hacer moviendo mi cuerpo y luego...
Okay, she's gonna do it like, it's a small song and a dance, and she'll do it, and then I'm gonna try and translate and copy it.
Es así. Cuerpo es mi tierra, agua es mi sangre, viento es mi aliento y fuego en mi corazón.
It says, okay, just so that... maybe we'll do it in Spanish because it will rhyme better, but let me just explain what it says. It says, my body is my earth, my water, the body is the earth, the water is my blood, fire is my breath, the wind is my breath, and fire is my heart. Yeah? So, yeah.
Vamos a repetirlo todos.
So we're going to repeat it all.
Cuerpo es mi sangre. No, perdón. Cuerpo es mi tierra.
Cuerpo es mi tierra.
Agua es mi sangre.
Agua es mi sangre.
Viento es mi aliento.
Viento es mi aliento.
Y hay fuego en mi corazón.
Y fuego en mi corazón.
Uno más. Cuerpo es mi tierra.
Cuerpo es mi tierra.
Agua es mi sangre.
Agua es mi sangre.
Viento es mi aliento.
Viento es mi aliento.
Y fuego en mi corazón.
Y fuego en mi corazón.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
I'd love to hear from you what you have already seen, especially in relation to communities in the heart of empire elsewhere. Yeah, what Doc is already working. I wonder what else is already. We can, as part of the knowledge exchange, we're in a particular situation. We're in Europe. We're in England, in this city. What else is already being done elsewhere that we can see, we can get to learn that might be happening in Europe or in the US in context that is similar to this one?
There's something really important. I come from a grassroots organization, but I'm not a representative of the communities. I work in the field with the communities. Sometimes we are the part of the people that are being menaced, no? And we denounce the situation, like in September 5 in this year. But to answer the question, I think it's a wrong question, because what we are doing is having the principle that we follow the mandate of the communities. So we can recognize when there's a real assembly in the community and they decided that they want, or they propose to do something, no? And we follow that in a fundamental way. So we never go beyond that, and we never do any other thing. So if the Zapatista communities, so the Zapatista, not the Zapatista army, but the communities, they proposed that organizations look for bridges in Europe, and going through what they call Europe up to Africa and Asia and the Middle East. That's a thing that we will follow. And they even asked, no? They published a communique where they asked our organizations if we were in agreement with that, which had never happened, but we answered and we signed it. No? It was a declaration of life, and at least 300 Mexican organizations signed this declaration. So you have seen people from the National Indigenous Congress, which I mentioned before, and from delegates, no? From the Zapatista. From the Zapatista National Liberation Army being present, no? In many countries. No? Probably you have been in the events. So this is to say that when we talk about international solidarity, it must be following the communities that they are speaking. They are telling us exactly what is the situation, and if they say no, that we are living in the front lines of a dictatorship, it does not mean that we are looking, no, of a way to solve that from here. No? We are looking for a way to answer what they are telling us. So it's the mandate of their communities and their organizations, which is our work. So the question, if I get it right, is saying exactly the contrary of that. No? So I wanted to answer in that sense. Thank you.
I'd really like to ask the women on the panel if there's anything particular that you'd like to say to the women's movement in Britain in terms of how we can support your decolonial struggle.
Primero, fajándonos bien los ovarios, porque cuando uno empieza a hacer la reivindicación, empieza a hacer esa revolución de ese camino, no es fácil. Creo que es de cómo ir recuperando tu propia cultura, de quién eres tú, de quiénes son tus padres y por qué estás aquí, para qué y cuál es tu propósito de lucha. Creo también que es de no vivir de las explotaciones de otras mujeres o no vivir de este sistema aquí en Europa, si la pregunta va específicamente para aquí, y también de cómo como mujeres tenemos que empezar a apoyar a otras mujeres, ¿no? A veces somos como que también vemos cuando están vulnerando, maltratando a otra hermana nuestra, dejamos que lo sigan haciendo, sino cómo somos sororas y solidarias con ellas, cómo las ayudamos. Y creo que desde ahí abarca esto de ir contra el colonialismo que nos impone sus normas, nos impone su reglamento a nosotras como mujeres constantemente, que nos quiere mantener sumisas, estar bajo su mano, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que va desde ese punto en cómo nosotras empezamos a crecer, a cómo surgimos, a cómo querer ayudar a las nuevas generaciones que están por venir, cómo las enseñamos a ir contra ese sistema, a cómo combatir, a cómo resistir, a ser resilientes a algo que queremos cambiar, las mentes que ya están impuestas con este colonialismo, cómo empezamos a cambiarles el chip, o sea, ¿no? a cómo implementarles otras luchas, otras resistencias de otras mujeres que por años les ha costado incluso la vida resistir para hoy en día tener lo que tenemos. En nuestro país las mujeres antes no votaban, hasta el año 53, si no me equivoco, que recién empezaron a votar las mujeres, pero eran solo las mujeres, las esposas de los militares, esposas de gente importante. Y después, recién nosotros como pueblos, como mujeres indígenas, recién tuvimos el acceso al voto. Recién votaban las mujeres analfabéticas, las mujeres que no sabían leer y escribir. Entonces, yo creo que la construcción de como mujeres aquí en Europa es seguir haciendo una revolución interna con nosotras mismas, porque somos primero nosotras quienes tenemos que hacer esa revolución que empieza desde la casa, que empezamos ahí a empezar a luchar contra todo esto y como decía, ¿no? Hay que ir con los ovarios bien puestos, bien fajados contra este sistema porque no es fácil a lo que nos enfrentamos día a día. Gracias.
So from our vision as women, the first thing we need to mention is that we need to have our ovaries in place. Because when we begin this revolutionary path, you need to know your own culture, you need to know your own lands. And what I propose for your struggle is you have to actually stop living off of the exploitation of peoples across the world. That's how you begin to support other women. We see how they, and also when you see how they harm your other sisters, how do you really stand in solidarity? You have to go against colonialism, as that is what is most violent against us. It is what also makes us submissive, and it's because of that we now have to uprise and support the new generations to be combative, to be resistant, and to be resilient. It's also about the mentalities that we impose and how we have to change the chip and share our struggles. And also, because also many women, they have given their life for us to be in this position. For example, in Peru, the women only have recently had voting rights. But when they got those voting rights, it was first only this class of military wives that got those rights. And now our indigenous people, at the cost of the struggle, have begun to get this right to vote. But we have to conduct this internal revolution in ourselves as well if we're going to struggle against this system and win. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd love to hear a bit about what childhood looks like in your communities and the work that you're doing, and what hosting spaces for children and childhood looks like.
I think the one thing when we explained just the experiences from different parts of our continents, because we're not from the same continents, but the challenges are explicitly the same. And what we can gather, all of us, is that the children are the most vulnerable, of course, and they are vulnerable to violences that even us as adults cannot even explain to them, let alone them being able to process. From South Africa, we might not have active wars, but just at the border of South Africa, we have Mozambique, which from the beginning of October has had some of the most violent protests. And those protests came as a result of election results that the majority of Mozambicans did not agree with. So you would then expect that there will be a spillage, and there will be, especially those from the border of their country or South Africa, will be affected. You might not have wars in South Africa, but you have other forms of violence, because we did say that violence is not just the bombs, it's not just the guns, but there are other forms of violence as well, where children are also at the receiving end of. You have, for instance, communities that are literal war zones, where people are killed every other day, where crime is just a serious issue. I think in the Eastern Cape, recently last month, there was a family of 18 people that were gunned down overnight. And just as we're shocked about that, or actually reeling from that shock, 5 more were killed, 6 more were killed. So those are the things that are happening. It might not be actual genocides, but the serious gun violence that is affecting the kids. You also have a situation where there is virtually or almost no access to education. And that comes as a result of the budget cuts that in most cases are affected by our governments who are getting a mandate from your governments, and most of the money that should be benefiting our people and our kids actually comes and benefits your guys and your kids and your healthcare and your education system. So what that therefore means is that whatever your kids have, you must just know that children in Africa do not necessarily have, even though that is where all the minerals are from, that is where the land is, that is where all the food is grown. But all of that gets shipped out, it comes to benefits other communities and other economies at the expense of African children. Thank you.
If one of the liberational movements or interactions is often seen as funding and funding models, especially in places where all of the money is tied up in organizations that are secured by empire. However, if all funding models, and especially grant models in this country in particular, or in other countries that are empire-centric, if they are built upon fraud and oppression, is there a way of these funding models working alongside liberation and providing or giving back that sovereignty of economy to other nations and other communities? Does that work? Is that something that we should be doing more of? Or is that simply more securing of oppression around the globe for a pseudo-liberation in this state or nation?
Because we find ourselves at such a critical time that the establishment is so desperate that they're resorting to the quite typical tactics of movement capture. And movement capture always involves money, because they always can find some of us, some that look like us, some that come from our communities, who they can buy off and give these funny positions in all of these dodgy NGOs that they're setting up and their governments around the world, while the rest of their people suffer in silence. We say that we're against this type of use of our people. We say that we're against the deliberate targeting of our communities. We say that we're against using people from the diaspora to do fake identity politics and use that against the communities of resistance who are suffering on the ground. And we say that this is an actual continuation of that violence, and it's nothing more than neo-colonial tactics, which many NGOs and well-meaning people are currently complicit in. We have to battle this right now because those of us in and around reparations movements in particular are seeing very heavy movement capture that insists that the question of Pan-African reparations is about money. It is not about money because we don't have our lands, we don't have our sovereignty, and no bit of money can ever account for the costs for the costs of the number of lives and many, many people whose names we don't know, who have been murdered and massacred and also just died in undignified situations in this country and beyond. But because we fail to study, because we fail to understand the system we're in and do what is necessary, we fail again at this hurdle on a daily basis. This is a fact, whether we like it or not, that those of us here are complicit in that reality. That is what we have to battle against if we want to do justice, international solidarity, and if we want to do justice to the restitution of resources, which are ours anyway. The other aspect of this is that imperialism has done this before and knows exactly what the situation it is in. It has a manual and a handbook and a tactical memory because it has been studying our revolutionary movements and our struggles for a very long time. When our revolutionary movements took power before, in the height of the decolonial period, when leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, people like Ho Chi Minh, when the struggling peoples in Vietnam said, no, we're not going to have NATO occupation in our communities and in our lands and fought back, the Western powers reorganized themselves, and taking the elite classes that they had organized, they rediscovered how they might assert and maintain power for a bit longer. We find ourselves in exactly that same moment now, which is why we also see that we're in another world war that is being imposed across, not only on all peoples of the world, but increasingly on the domestic colonies who are being brought into that war through surveillance programs, through the NGO industrial complex, and through militarization. This is why they're targeting young people in this country with military propaganda to join their armies as a sustainable future or a job. This is again the reality we find ourselves in. But when our movements attempted to take power, it was parties like the British Labour Party that conspired with intelligence forces around the world to come into our parts of the world and murder our leaders and demonize them. So much so that into this day, in Ghana, where I come from, it is very difficult to get a copy of a book by Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first independence leader of Ghana and insisted that Ghana would not be free until the total liberation of Africa was taking place. And when he attempted to do this, he was violently wiped out, largely with the complicity of a very miseducated domestic class who had been colonized in the British Isles. This stuff is happening through policy programs and discussions that no one sees. And this is why we say security and visibility is important, because it's happening in our communities. You can go to any ends in this country and agents are being placed in our communities to police our community centres, to keep a watch on our young people and make sure that those of us who are interested in change have to be brought off to take one of their jobs. This is why there is a current cry out about a knife crime epidemic in this country. Even though we know that the billions and trillions that is going into militarization and putting drugs and criminal activities into our communities is a cost that none of us have a number on. And yet we know that the biggest expenditure on violence exported around the world is the more than $1 trillion budget for the US military machine. To the funding point. So when those of us are saying that we must have our resources back, and we must have the autonomy to use those resources as we see fit, we know that we're talking about pennies in the ocean of trillions of pounds that is funding a military beast and a machine that is destroying life on Earth. We do not understand why the environmental movement refuses to talk about the military-industrial complex, which is quite obviously the biggest killer of Earth and people in this world today. When you look at a map of Africa and you see the number of US military bases implanted on our continent, and you see the military occupation of including our national airport in Ghana today by a British elitist trained Ghanaian president who calls himself Akufo-Addo, who's building statues of himself out of our gold, you have to wonder why we ask for the small amount of resources that we need for our movements to do what they need to do, why it's policed by well-meaning people who think they're well-to-do, people who think they know our struggle better than us, people who are insisting on going into their funny spaces to create more terms and conditions that we have to sign up to. And this is why our people insist on repossessing and taking back those lands and those resources by any means necessary, because it's often the case that when we try to ask very kindly for what we need to do, we are policed in doing so. This has happened very recently, this happens in and around our networks, and there are those people who are committed to understanding the complexities of this, who are going on their own educational journey through networks that we're establishing with things like the Planet Repairs Action Learning Education Revolution, who have come to understand what meaningful solidarity means to us. And that is why we've had to take it upon ourselves as well to even create structures like the Prayler Fund, the Planet Repairs Action Learning Education Revolution Fund, where it can be autonomously decided by our indigenous communities of resistance how those resources have to be used. We refuse the terms and conditions that are forcing us to jump through hoops and create new ideas like climate injustice and environmental X, Y, and Z, instead of being allowed to talk about social and national liberation and the liberation of indigenous communities. Because that is ultimately the answer to the issues that are facing our communities, that is ultimately the answer to the issues we face in the diaspora, and that is ultimately the answer to people racialized whites as whites in Europe. And if there's one other anecdote, it's that in the 50s and 60s, when Western imperialism was quite scared and was starting to crumble, and they needed to plan how they could stop the rising masses of people in this country, they insisted on a policy of not allowing international solidarity to continue. They targeted the dialogue that was emerging between colonised communities within countries like Britain and colonised communities of resistance in parts of Africa, Asia, Abiyala, Aotearoa, the so-called New Zealand, Australia. And they did this in a very sophisticated way. First, they forced us to not talk about the struggles in what happened in other parts of the world. With products like the BBC and the British Council, they went around the world and taught lies to hundreds of millions of children around the world. They still do this, and this is still funded by, overwhelmingly, but by the people. While that invisibilization happened, and they taught people to be scared of colonized community resistance, telling the truth about the violence that is being suffered in our communities, they then took the labour, expropriated labour again from our parts of the world to build the welfare system that keeps this system and the optic of Britain working and security alive. And ever since the 50s and 60s, they've managed to sustain that same lie that global Britain is a safe place and it makes sense to have people dying while they're trying to get here and suffering in whatever hazardous journeys to make it to Britain, because the lies that are still being told about the space are still reaching all corners of the world. The reason why we've insisted that we have a Decolonial Open Communiversity is because it's conversations like this between peoples and educational relationships that we need to build so that we can educate ourselves about the truth that would allow us to navigate the tactical hellstorm of imperialism that is waging a counterinsurgency war in our homes, in our communities, and in our schools. And for that reason, the funding issue is very important, because resources must be restituted to the front lines. We must accept that the surplus resources in this country come at the expense of colonised communities everywhere, and those resources have to be returned. And that's one easy option to make a contribution, but people should also be thinking now directly about how to support actively, with visibility, and with the real struggle and sacrifice that is required, actual community resistance to take back their lands and free us all from this land. Thank you. Allowed. And ever since the 50s and 60s, they've managed to sustain that same lie that global Britain is a safe place and it makes sense to have people dying while they're trying to get here and suffering in whatever hazardous journeys to make it to Britain, because the lies that are still being told about the space are still reaching all corners of the world. The reason why we've insisted that we have a Decolonial Open Communiversity is because it's conversations like this between peoples and educational relationships that we need to build so that we can educate ourselves about the truth that would allow us to navigate the tactical hellstorm of imperialism that is waging a counterinsurgency war in our homes, in our communities, and in our schools. And for that reason, the funding issue is very important, because resources must be restituted to the front lines. We must accept that the surplus resources in this country come at the expense of colonised communities everywhere, and those resources have to be returned. And that's one easy option to make a contribution, but people should also be thinking now directly about how to support actively, with visibility, and with the real struggle and sacrifice that is required, actual community resistance to take back their lands and free us all from this land. Thank you.
But for those that do have more privilege with money, please do find a little, Frankie's going to hold up something right now. If you see any of those around the room, there's a little QR code, one at the back over there as well. If you're able to donate, please do that. That donates to the Prayer Fund. That will send you to a little website where you can read a lot more on what that money is going towards. But it's essentially funneling the excess of money in the Global North to communities on the front lines in the Global South. So please do. And there's also a bunch of stalls at the back with different artisanal items made by some of the communities here that they've brought along, as well as made by our local community that we're raising money for, the Prayer Fund as well. So please do, if you can, go buy something. There's some delicious apple cider vinegar up there as well. I'll buy yours too. But yeah, so we're gonna move on. I just big up. Thank you so much for everyone being on the panel. Let's give them one more round of applause.
Education is preparation for reparations.